It's kind of fun to be back in the swing of things, talking about ufology, and our good friend A.R. Roberts is here. His book is called From Atom to Omega, An Anatomy of UFO Phenomena. You can check out his website at www.fromatoomega.com. Again, Alan, thank you for taking time out on your Saturday night to be here with us.
The pleasure's all mine, Pat.
So where can, speaking of your book, where can people get it at Amazon? Where can they buy your book?
It's available Amazon.com, Barnes & Noble, and on iUniverse.com, which is the publisher's website. The prices are better on Amazon. But now it's a pretty large book. It's 522 pages, and the hardcover, it's available hardcover. The going price is $40.95, but you can get a little bit cheaper on Amazon, and the softcover. That goes retails at $30.95, but again, you can get that a little less expensive on Amazon. It's also available on ebooks on Kindle and Nook on Barnes and Noble, Kindle on Amazon. So
very affordable there.
Oh yeah, very, very affordable.
So affordable you can't buy a hot dog for yourself.
That's for sure.
But that, hey, no, it is a great book, and I've gone through it and have just deeply read some of the chapters. One question I actually wrote down, I pulled all my notes up we've had you on, I think, 3 or 4 times, and looked through all the show notes. In the Bible anywhere, again, I know you took this thing apart and really went through it, and with a fine-tooth comb. Does anywhere in the Bible, does anybody ever talk about strange-looking individuals? Is there ever a mention of an individual that looks different, maybe in regards to an alien, maybe in regards to a reptilian or a Nordic? Is that ever mentioned, or do you ever get a sense of that where when they're talking about a story, when there's information being written down about something, and again, it's all interpretation, but a unique-looking individual?
Well, you've got a lot of stories of demons and that sort of thing, and devils, but there really isn't any real descriptions there. In fact, even the Lord came down and speak to Moses in a cloud or in the tent of meeting. I mean, there's no description of him or the angels, except that they always seem to appear in a cloud or a bright flash of light, and that kind of suggests teleportation.
Right.
But that's a whole aspect. I cover that pretty thoroughly, and I think it's chapter 12, or I think it's chapter 12 in the book on technology in the Bible. And there's so many, what I'm talking about here tonight just hasn't even scratched the surface of the information that's in the book, but I mean, there's just so much of it, and there's so many allusion clues to teleportation, to force fields, to laser weapons. I mean, all kinds of. In fact, pretty much the same technologies you just see on Star Trek. And like I say in the book, I just wondered if Gene Roddenberry and his writers didn't get a lot of their ideas from the Bible.
Yeah, yeah.
But of course, there's no way to know. But it just seems like when you read these things from a logical perspective, it kind of makes you think about Star Trek a lot. And and these are technologies that supposedly nobody it didn't exist any known race, at the time, back in that era. So, I mean, if it is technology that's been misinterpreted and perceived as miracles, well, naturally any kind of technology would be magic, to somebody back then, because they had no technology of their own, by which to make a comparison. So, but as far as descriptions, the only thing I noticed in the biblical era, there was never any mention of how these angels or the Lord, how they were dressed or what they were wearing. And the fact that there was nothing odd about their appearance, Moses never, as often as he met face to face with the Lord, he never said there was anything unusual about his appearance, like pointed ears, green skin, or big bulging eyes, or anything. So obviously he appeared as a normal human being, and so did the angels. But as far as they were dressed, the only difference in dress seemed to be there seemed to be clues in that in Ezekiel's encounter, because from what he described of these beings that came down in this craft, they seemed to be, it suggested that they were wearing highly reflective or metallic style fabric in their uniforms. The way he described them is the way they were glowing, but I don't think they were glowing. It was probably a reflection of lights in the ship that was reflecting off their faces and clothing, and the being that he saw described as being up on the upper section of the craft that referred to himself as a sovereign lord. You know, from his waist up he looked like fire. From there down, from the waist up he looked. I forgot exactly how it was worded, but he looked like fire. But from there down, the glow was much brighter, where he looked more like fire. And I think he was standing over an open hatch, and the light reflecting out of this open hatch was reflecting off of the upper part of his uniform, which I guess it gleamed like glowing metal or something like that. And from there down, he looked like fire, because from there down he was closer to the light being reflected from this open hatch. You know, and there's no other descriptions of how these angels or these beings were dressed except in the New Testament, and that's when all of a sudden the angels, after Christ's resurrection, all of a sudden they're all wearing white, and I think the reason for that, after his resurrection, is I think it was a medical team that was assigned to keep an eye on him, because I don't think he really died on the cross. I think he may have been in a state of suspended animation. And it sounds crazy, I know, but
no.
I spelled that all out in a book. It makes a lot of sense, to where I think, you know, this what was it? A fellow by the name of Nicodemus helped bring him down off the cross, and then it was this fellow by the name of Joseph of Arimathea Joseph of Arimathea. Yeah, nobody seems to know anything about him. He just appeared out of nowhere after Christ was crucified, and somehow he managed to secure his, from Pontius Pilate, managed to secure his body, and right away, and him and Nicodemus put him in the tomb, and then they sealed up the tomb, and they disappeared. You know, you didn't hear anything more about them. And I just wondered, you know, if Christ himself was teleported out of the tomb, you know, to be. And from what we gather about teleportation, the molecules of the body, I mean, if you pass through closed windows, walls, and ceilings, like is described in many abduction cases where these people are taken aboard their ship, they obviously pass through solid objects. And for that to happen, the molecular structure of the body has to be thinned out, so to speak. You know, molecules are made of atoms, and the atoms have to be spread far enough apart to reduce molecular density, which very possibly could allow the molecules of the body to pass through solid objects. Sure. And if that's what happened, it may have happened before, this Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus were still in the tomb before they sealed it up. He may have been teleported out right at that point, because they had to, the medical team had to take care of the wounds in his side and his arms, his feet and his hands or wrists. I believe the nails were probably put through the wrists, as most people today seem to think. And if that was the case, his molecules would have spread apart. All the atoms in his body would have passed through this shroud that had him covered up, and it would have, and I think that may be some explanation for how the image of that man appears on the Shroud of Turin, if that is really Christ's burial shroud. So, if it ever proves to be the real thing, I think an investigation along that line, I think the image may have been created by radiation that was released during this molecular expansion phase, because it would have passed through the the cloth all around his body, and there's evidence that on the back and the front of the shroud of this image. So I think that's a viable explanation. Whether it's true or not, I don't know. There's no way to prove it.
Right.
But
well,
again,
and what I like about your book, Alan, is you put the reference in the Bible in there. So if somebody, if you give your interpretation, and if somebody wants to go look, there's enough details that you can tell them exactly. They can go find it on their own.
Exactly, and that's what I did. I referenced chapter and verse for most of this stuff, and to show that I'm just not making it up out of my head. I mean, that's what the Bible says. So.
We got a caller on hold. You want to take a call?
Sure.
All right. Caller, good evening. Welcome to K-Talk. You're on with A.R. Roberts.
Interesting subject. I have a question.
Yeah.
There's a word, and I think it comes out of the Old Testament, Nephilim. Does that mean anything to you?
Nephilim?
Nephilim?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, those are the sons of God that supposedly came down out of the sky, and they mated with all the earth women and had children by them that supposedly were giants. But Nephilim, you can take it two ways. It could be the beings that came down out of the sky, or the children that were produced by these beings that mated with earth women. So it's hard to define exactly which way. Some areas you can take it either way. So, but in many areas, other ancient manuscripts, they're labeled as the Watchers. So,
right.
Again, they apparently were still around, or at least the descendants of the Nephilim were still around to be defeated in the Promised Land. They were one of the first to be defeated in the Promised Land by the Moses and the Israelites after they came out of Egypt. So, and that kind of leads you to wonder about the floods. Supposedly, the flood wiped out everybody except Noah and his family. But since the Nephilim were still around to be defeated, obviously they weren't affected by the flood. Then makes you wonder just how bad this flood really was. And I really doubt it was a worldwide thing. I think it was just covered just pretty much a local area where the people that they wanted to get rid of were involved.
Do you ever feel as though every answer that you find, you have two more questions then?
Many cases, yes.
Yeah. Hey, thank you very much.
Hey, and Greg, I'm still trying to find that Philadelphia experiment guy, so just hang in there, okay? I'm looking. All right. Yeah, it is interesting, and again, it's like you said, it's all subject to interpretation.
Exactly.
But that's what I like about your book, and why I encourage people to pick it up, because it's one of those things that you can almost use as like a technical manual. You can read through it. You don't have to read it from cover to cover, because when you do it, I think the best way to read your book is to have the book and then have the Bible right there, and the things that interest you, just open it up and read your interpretation or what you got out of it, and then read what's written and see if you get the same thing or if you get close. And that I found that actually is a pretty fun exercise.
Yeah, it's true. I always felt there was at least two sides to every story. In many cases, there's more than two. It could be 3, 4, even 5. Depending on who's telling the story. And what I've done with the Bible, I've just presented a different side based on a logical interpretation of the Scriptures. And I'm sure other people could come up with other ideas there, but I tried to be very logical in the interpretations, looking at things, the technical aspects of it. That's what I put in the book is what the information suggested to me.
Right.
And I'd be very interested to hear from anybody that has any different ideas about it. If they've read the book and checked the references, see if their interpretations are any better. But what I did, a lot of the interpretations are not just based on what I read in that particular passage. It meant backtracking a lot of times to compare it with other things that hinted at certain aspects, at certain things that that caused me to come up with the interpretation that I did. I mean, it's not always reading like, well, for this story of Adam and Eve. If I had to go through it a lot, and then I had to go. It was other stories later on that seemed to revert to a lot of information back in the time of Adam and Eve. And, when you put it all together and you analyze all of this information, then, I mean, that's how I came up with a lot of my ideas. But, I'm not, like I said, I'm not claiming they're right. I'm not claiming they're correct at all. And it's just another way to look at things, from a logical perspective.
Oh no, exactly. When you've been on a lot of talk shows, Alan, and talked about the book, and I know you've given some presentations. Do you get some people that this maybe offends a little bit because you're kind of you're kind of bending it a little bit? Do you ever have people get offended?
I only have one person that recently I came across in this past month that she started to read the book, and but then she said it offended her personal beliefs. But and I told her, I says, look, I'm not trying to offend your personal beliefs. I'm just expressing a viewpoint, and I'm not saying that it's true. I'm just saying, there's another way to look at this if you want to look at it from a logical perspective. But I respect your feelings, and obviously she didn't read the whole thing because, I specified in the beginning, to anybody that's reading it, try putting aside for the moment, any preconceived ideas you may have about UFOs, God, and religion, and accept nothing more than the possibility that the information I'm presenting could be true. And I'm not saying that it is true, but apparently she didn't read the whole thing. I guess what she did read, she's too absorbed in. Well, she's a diehard Catholic, so and she was grown up with these beliefs, and nothing's going to change her mind. And I can't blame her for that. I'm sure there's a lot of people the same way. But so far, she's the only person that's really come out and said anything about it. I've talked to a lot of people that said, I don't necessarily agree with everything you said, but, I really have to think about this a little bit more, because apparently I hit a nerve in a lot of people. And I said, what I put in the book makes a lot of sense, but even though it's hard, even as adults, to believe or to accept some of these viewpoints, because they've been ingrained in your head from childhood. You're growing up believing this is what you're supposed to believe, and it's hard even as adults to accept anything else. And like I say, I'm not convinced of miracles or anything like that. Because I think there's a logical explanation for a lot of this stuff. And like, for instance, ghosts. Now I'm probably going to get nailed on this one here, but I don't particularly believe in ghosts. Now, I think there may be something out to it. What, I don't know. But take poltergeist, for instance. I think poltergeist, or maybe even a lot of these ghost stories you hear, they all seem to, I don't know how to explain it. I think it's the manifestation of someone's subconscious brain activity. And there's a lot about the brain we don't know about. And most of these stories seem, especially where poltergeists are involved, seems there's always a child or an adolescent involved. Mm-hmm. And now, at least I've watched a lot of this stuff on TV, these hauntings stories and these ghost stories, and in almost every case there's a child involved. So I think it might be the unconscious brain activity of children or an adolescent. And another thing I've noticed is all of these ghost stories, they've always involved Christians, Italians, Spanish people. I've yet to see one involve a Jewish family. Mm-hmm. And And I've talked to some Jewish people who don't believe in this stuff. They don't believe in demons or ghosts or anything like that. I've never seen a story that involves a Jewish family. I could be wrong. I mean, there may have been that I missed, but I've watched a lot of this stuff, and that's something I've yet to see. So I'm just wondering how much of this stuff is psychosomatic, maybe.
Yeah. No, you got to look at it. You've got to look at it in all different, from all different angles and directions. You said something at the beginning of the show that I thought was interesting about, we talked a little bit about disclosure, and if it were to happen, people with these beliefs, these religious beliefs, how would they react? And a question I've got is, one thing that, at least in the ufology community, that seems to get a little interconnected is ufology and the Catholic Church. I'm not saying there's anything written in stone anywhere. I can't produce a document for you, but that the Catholic Church seems to have interest in it. Maybe that would be the best statement I could make. And if this is true, do you think it would, if something, along the lines of talking about aliens coming out or alien beings coming out, that maybe it would be best for not the government or even the president, but for one of the religious leaders? Would it be the Pope that would be best to come out with something like this and bring something like this forward?
It would have to be someone like the Pope that would get through to the people. Just anybody saying anybody can say anything, but if it came from the Pope, I think then a lot of people would begin to take it seriously. But that's something that has to be, people have to be psychologically conditioned to accept that kind of a thing. It's not something that, and it can't happen overnight. That's why I think full disclosure, if it ever comes out, is probably going to be maybe a century away, because people have to slowly be conditioned to where these ideas become, so common that when it does come out, that people will be more open to accept it, and because the ideas in their mind will gradually change, especially as technologies begin to improve. And, we get more technology. We learn things that today, it would seem like magic 50 years ago, but all of a sudden today we got technologies. It makes it a fact rather than fiction or magic or supernatural or anything. But it's a conditioning that people have to be. Their minds have to be conditioned to be able to accept this without causing a mass worldwide chaos in a religious community. Now, because I think if full disclosure was made, they didn't come out and say, and the president come out and say, yeah, UFOs are real, we made contact, blah, blah, blah. And I don't think that would turn the world upside down as much as if they come out and said, well, Jesus Christ was a hybrid, and so was Isaac, Samson, and John the Baptist, and right. That kind of thing, and then they've said all these biblical miracles that you believe so much in weren't really miracles; they were just the demonstration of aliens' technology. And I think that's a little bit more than people could take right now, especially the true believers. Well, there'd be some that would accept it, but
we got a couple calls stacking up. We'll get some calls here in a second, but you got to look into the science of things too, Alan. Right. Like at the time of, and I'm not going to belate on this, but at the time of Moses, talk about how Moses parted the Red Sea. Well, science has proved at that time the Red Sea was about 3 feet deep. It was a big marsh.
The Sea of Reeds was, yeah.
Right. There's a lot of things there that you got to take a scientific look and an open mind look at.
Yeah. See, the Red Sea is a misperception, because the Reed Sea has often been misunderstood as being the Red Sea, and the Red Sea, that's about 100 miles from in the shortest span of it. It spans about 100 miles. It would have taken the people probably weeks,
to get through.
100,000 or more people, several 100,000 people with animals, carts, wagons, and I mean, and they couldn't do it in one night. It would take about several weeks. And I think what the references to the Reed Sea or Sea of Reeds is probably more accurate. But then again, when you look at in the technological aspect, a force field could have parted the Red Sea very easily. And it had to be dried from the inside out. I mean, it says the surface had been dried to a hardened surface because I had animals and carts to get through, and otherwise it'd be bogged down in mud.
Right.
So it had to be dry. And what could do that except maybe some form of microwave radiation that dried it from the inside out? But then, you know, when they got through it, then all of a sudden the Lord lifted the cloud that was blocking the Egyptian army, and they tried to go through the sea after him, and then my interpretation is the Lord turned off the force field, and the water just came crashing down over them. And
let's get to a couple calls. We got a few stacking up for you, all right?
Sure.
All right. Caller, good evening. You're on with Alan Roberts.
Yeah, Greg again.
Hey, Greg.
He brought up a subject that I need to poke at him and ask about. Have you ever, sir, have you ever gone and taken a Kabbalah class?
I'm sorry, taken a what kind of class?
The mystical core of Judaism. You mentioned that you haven't heard of too many Jews that are into mysticism. There is an actual study called Kabbalah, and it's the mystical core of Judaism.
Yeah. No, I haven't really studied that so much, but the only thing I remember about the Kabbalah is that the rapture, 7,000 people will be rise into the air in the form of light, you know, and that sounds again like teleportation, you know. But no, I have not read the Kabbalah.
Well, it's further than just reading the Kabbalah. Generally speaking, you study with a group under a Kabbalah expert, and there is one right on K-Talk Radio, and that's who I took the class from, Mr. Jim Kirkwood. And it was a very interesting study in the mystical core of Judaism. Appreciate your... Go ahead.
I'm going to take that. I've talked to Jim. Jim's a good friend of mine. I'd like to go through that and experience it.
It's quite a class.
Yeah. That's what I've heard.
Thank you.
Thanks, Greg. Want to take another one?
Sure.
All right. Hold on. Come on, line 4. Caller, good evening. Welcome to K-Talk. You're on with A.R. Roberts.
Hey, how's it going, Adam?
Good.
Hey, Adam, I think that...
It's Alan. It's Alan. Sorry.
Alan, I'm sorry. I apologize.
It's okay.
I think I believe, you when you say that you don't believe in ghosts. I'm with you on that. But I believe that I've had a lot of UFO experiences, literally too many to talk about on a show, which is kind of rare, probably awfully rare. But I've seen the triangle one, and I do believe that it's kind of a half and half, half intelligence from people and from half intelligence from extraterrestrials, kind of a montage. It flew over. It had no sound. It was only about 100 feet above us. It gave off a small droning sound, a little, I guess, a humming sound, very small. But when it got down about 600 yards downrange, then all of a sudden we heard a sound that sounded very heavy duty. So I'm not sure what that was all about. I just believe it had some kind of silencer on it or something. But I believe that when people talk about balls of light, I believe that that's extraterrestrial. That's the extraterrestrial version of a periscope, that the Navy would have to look above the water to see if anything's wrong. I think it's something they use to look around without having to physically bring their vehicles down here or anything like that. What do you think about that?
That's very possible. That's very, very possible. In fact, I think that may be what happened in the Rendlesham Forest case with this when they were watching this red ball of light maneuver through the trees in Rendlesham Forest there.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and there was a couple of sightings. There was a vehicle sighted as well as the ball of light that apparently looked like an eyeball. Yeah, I just wanted to know what your opinion was on that. I definitely am not a real believer in ghosts, but I believe there's intelligence that do show up that are not necessarily of human origin. I just wanted to know what your take on was that. I also saw but your UFO that you saw was round, was it not?
It was oval shaped.
Oval shaped, okay.
Mm-hmm.
I saw a pack of about 13 round ones go over me that were probably about 12,000 feet high, and I could only imagine they would probably be maybe about 100 feet across. They look like quarters borne over, you know. The lights of Las Vegas lit up the bottoms of them, and they just basically look like a bunch of quarters flying over me.
Where was this sighting at?
This was in Las Vegas.
In Las Vegas.
And when they went over, they were, for UFOs, they were only traveling kind of the speed that you would expect from maybe one of our fighter jets. But 3 or 4 of them kept jumping out of the pack, basically disappearing and then coming back into the pack. 3 or 4 times they did that as they were traveling in a general motion. So whatever they were UFOs of some kind, but they were round. They weren't oval. And I just find that your experience is enlightening. There are so many different kinds of them, and there's no telling. There's no telling what we're dealing with here.
Yeah, all kinds of different shapes and sizes.
Yes,
it's a bigger universe than we realize.
I also saw, and this was very unusual, a daytime sighting 2 weeks before the Phoenix lights showed up in Phoenix. I saw a boomerang-shaped thing above Mount Charleston in Las Vegas that looked like it was about 40,000 feet high and looked like it was 3/4 of a mile long, but at arm's length it was probably only the size of a garbanzo bean, or maybe smaller, more like a pea. And but there were planes taking off from McCarran Airport that were veering away from it. Normally their flight path would take them over the mountains in that direction, but they were taking veering away from it, and I can only imagine that they had it in sight and were telling the people aboard the planes to take another route, because this thing was sitting still in the air for 45 minutes, completely still, silent, without moving at all.
That's very interesting.
Yeah, it was very, very interesting. And 2 weeks later, the boomerang Phoenix lights showed up at nighttime, and the people said that the vehicle was said to have come from the north of Arizona and made its way down to the location where it was seen finally at night above Phoenix.
It was seen as far north as Henderson, Nevada, all the way down to Tucson before it reversed direction and headed back north.
So I suspect I saw the same vehicle in broad daylight, and nobody said anything the next day in the paper or on the news, which I found extremely odd.
Well, it did raise a lot of... there was a lot of news coverage when it was sighted, because the TVs and radio stations were deluged with calls about this thing. In fact, the sighting of those flares at the Maryland National Guard dropped over the Berry Goldwater Test Range at Vuk Air Force Base, and they flew up from Tucson, from Davis-Monthan Air Force Base, to conduct this exercise, this flare exercise, and that confused a lot of people, because they were calling in the radio stations about both sightings at the same time. Well, one sighting occurred at 8:15, the other one was around 10 10:15. And at 10:15, people were still calling in about the 8:15 sighting, but now everybody
Sure.
in Phoenix was seeing these flares and confusing the two. And it took a while before everybody, they finally got to realize there was two separate things going on there.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for taking my call. Nice to talk to you, Adam.
Take care, my friend. Have a good night.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. People are seeing a lot of unique things, Alan.
That's for darn sure. Jeez. It's unbelievable. Well, when I was in the Ground Observer Corps, the sighting that I detail here tonight, I mean, that was just one. I'd seen a lot of other things up there during my watch at night, and there's no way to know what they were, but they were weird, some weird things. One night this orange light came out of the southeast, and it was rather low. I mean, there were jets at Ethan Allen Air Force Base over in the Burlington area, which is where this thing came out of, and it looked like the afterburner of a jet fighter, except it was a lot larger than what the afterburners. I'd seen a lot of those jets at night, and this thing passed over my head, not a sound. It disappeared into the northwest, and then just a few minutes later, there was a couple of jets from Ethan Allen came shooting across the lake at very low altitude with afterburners engaged. And that was unusual because, normally they don't use afterburners at night over a populated area flying at such a low altitude. It looked like they were in pursuit of this thing. But then about a half hour later, this light came back out of, if it was the same one or one just like it, came back out of the northwest, and it passed by in a southeasterly direction. It was slightly north of our post, not a sound. And then the two jets, I assume it was the same two jets, came back out of the northeast, and you could hear them coming from way off, and it seemed like they were on the same trajectory as this orange light. So I don't know what that orange light was. I thought maybe it might be some new type of aircraft they were experimenting with or something, but I don't see where they would, fly an experimental craft over a populated area, and I'd called it in as an unknown jet. I thought it was a jet, and but it was weird. I mean, there was a couple other things. I hadn't seen a whole bunch of stuff, but it's just too much. I'd never have time tonight to get into it all. But I detailed all of that stuff in the book, in the preface of the book. So.
Well, it's amazing. It's amazing what we're seeing out there. And again, like the caller that just called in, I mean, people are seeing stuff everywhere. Let's hit one last thing on your talking points. We've got about 12, 15 minutes left. Bob Lazar, or Lazar.
Bob Lazar, yeah.
He, of course, he made a lot of statements way back when. He popped out again at the UFO conference down in Fountain Hills in Phoenix back in February. He seems to stick to his story. Give me your thoughts on Lazar.
Well, I had a whole thing to talk about him, but we'll never have time to get through it. But I had mixed feelings about him because his educational background was in question. And he comes across as a very credible person, but then when you look at his academic background, that seems to be in question. Now, what's credible, I find credible about his story is that he knew about when these test flights were going to be done with the craft that he was working on there at the S4 site, and he brought John Lear and some other people out into the desert on the Wednesday. He knew it was tested on Wednesday nights at a certain time, and he took these people out into the desert to witness this. And John Lear swears that in 1989 he witnessed the test flight of this the craft, and he said it appeared at precisely the exact time that Lazar said it would. Well, how would he know, that this thing is going to be tested on that particular night, unless he was telling the truth? And then you've got the fact that, let me see, I got some notes on him here somewhere. There's one in particular. He told a story to George Knapp, KLAS TV in Las Vegas. not, he was skeptical, but he said, you know, if the story is true, it's dynamite. So he decided to check on Lazar's credibility on the fact that he said he had worked at Los Alamos National Laboratory. And when he called Los Alamos, they had no record of him ever having worked there. But yet his name and phone number, his extension phone number, is in the book, in the lab's phone directory from the time that he said he worked there. Knapp was able to locate some people that had worked with him on classified projects there. But the thing is, Lazar didn't work for Los Alamos. He was working for a private contractor who was working there. And the only proof that he had is his employment records had disappeared, so he had no way to prove that he worked at this S4 base or this secret base. And the only thing he had was his W-2 form for his 1989 tax return that shows he was employed by the Department of Naval Intelligence. And I looked all over the internet for this Department of Naval Intelligence, and I couldn't find anything. The only thing that came up was this rather crazy video clip of an alleged interview with its gray alien. But there is an Office of Naval Intelligence, but I can't find anything for a Department of Naval Intelligence. Well, obviously it existed because that was a source of his paycheck. And then there was the fact that Lazar's credibility was questioned when he made a statement in 1989 that this UFO's propulsion, the propulsion system was based on this element 115.
Right.
And scientists considered him a Looney Tune because there was no such element, and they said it was an element that was impossible to create. Well, let me see. I got the details on that here. Hold on, let me just. Okay, here we go. As I needed the names of these companies. In 2004, an international team of scientists at the Joint Institute for Nuclear Research in Dubna, Russia, and also the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory in California announced the discovery of a brand new element 115. And they said they believed they'd made it back in 2003, but before it could be declared official, it had to be independently confirmed by other scientists. So they gave it this temporary name of unpentium until such confirmation could be made. Then 11 years later, in 2014, thanks to a team of Swedish and German scientists, confirmation was made, and element 115 joined the others on the periodic table. I mean, Lazar knew, back in 1989 that the element couldn't be created then, and he remained, pretty adamant in the faces of all these scientists that had ridiculed him for 14 years in his claim that the element did exist. But the important thing is, how did he know it existed?
Right, back then.
Unless his claim of working on a UFO propulsion system is true. And then, as far as why he can't remember the names of any of his professors and why the institutions where he claimed to have received his education have no record of him attending in those schools, MIT and Caltech, what if he was playing a role in the government disinformation campaign?
Sure.
Now, conceivably, he could have attended MIT and Caltech under a different identity, in which case maybe his education was sponsored by one of these black budget projects. And it's a common practice, for the CIA to provide people within the witness protection program with completely new identities. So giving Lazar a pseudo identity that would have been no trouble at all. And as for his picture not appearing in the yearbooks of Caltech or MIT, well, he could have just stayed away from school in those days when the pictures were taken. If he was part of a disinformation campaign, his picture in a yearbook under a different name, well, that would have blown his cover. And even if he did go to MIT or Caltech, obviously he got his education somewhere, and wherever that was. maybe by naming as professors, that could have conceivably exposed the operation. Especially, some tenacious UFO investigator dug deep enough, for the information. So, so there is a lot of credibility to what he says. But if he was part of a disinformation campaign, then you have to wonder, how much. Well, disinformation, usually is filled with a lot of false information, but it's usually salted with some of the truth. So if he was part of a disinformation campaign, then you have to wonder, what part of the information that he disclosed is fact, and how much may be fabrication. But, it really makes you wonder. One of the things he said he was told at this S4 complex was that there was an information exchange program taking place at the facility with aliens. And how long has that been going on? And when did we establish contact with these aliens? Is it possible that maybe there's some truth to the rumors of Eisenhower meeting with aliens back in the 1950s? Maybe that's something you want to ask your next guest, because I understand that MUFON has some files of witnesses, people that witnessed his meeting with these aliens, where they made an agreement to give them a base on this planet in exchange for some technological information. So, and I'm waiting for MUFON to release these files. I guess from what I understand, they are going to put them out on the internet eventually, but maybe she knows something about it, on your next guest. So you might want to ask her about that.
And she's the new she's been the director of MUFON here for Utah. It's been about, I think, since October. So, but she's definitely dug deep into things, and there's so much stuff. Well, and I agree with you too. I've had Stanton Friedman on the show, and of course he thinks Lazar is nothing but a phony, and and has done all the digging. And there's a lot of other people that do too. But again, like you said, there's a lot of stuff that came to fruition. And it's like, maybe, I don't know, maybe the guy, maybe he was there for disinformation. Maybe he just wanted to go out and say, hey, look, I don't care what happens. Here's what I saw. Here's what I did. Let the people of the world, let me tell you about it. You can either believe or you don't have to believe. It's up to you.
Yeah, well, he came through on his TV interviews as very convincing. He didn't stammer. He looked the camera straight in the eye. He spoke with authority, and his story hasn't changed in all these years, not one bit. So and that kind of gives him some credibility. And then if his story is true, I just wonder if it has any connection with the stuff that Gary McKinnon. You've heard of Gary McKinnon?
Yes.
The stuff that he came out with about this secret space fleet that the U.S. has out there in orbit, whether, pardon me, but, it just makes me wonder. And the fact that the U.S., dropped all charges against him, they wanted to extradite him. 10 years, they were claiming, but the Brits wouldn't let him, wouldn't honor the extradition because he has Asperger's syndrome. Mm-hmm. And if he was incarcerated, it could result in him committing suicide. But, I just wonder, how serious the government was. Can you imagine what would have happened if they extradited him and sentenced him here in this country? Well, the trial, if any of that stuff was brought out in trial, that it could have exposed a massive NASA cover-up.
Sure.
And it would have made, exposed this supposedly this space fleet that's called Solar Warden. That's what McKinnon called it. He claims that he saw a roster detailing ship-to-ship and fleet-to-fleet transfers, plus a file that listed the name of a whole bunch of non-terrestrial personnel of different ranks, but he couldn't tell if they were Army, Navy, or Air Force, or whatever. But it really makes you wonder.
Well, look at Buzz Aldrin. He's come out on many occasions and said, when they landed on the moon, he said these ships were. He said he saw these ships sitting right up on these mountaintops with their lights on, looking down at him. He's gone on television. Edgar Mitchell, same thing. They saw craft on the moon.
And then, a lot of the researchers, they think that this Solar Warden project may have gone back to Ronald Reagan's time. I mean, what's that? An address to the United Nations. He says, I occasionally think, how quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world.
Exactly.
And yet I ask you, is not an alien force already among us? Yeah. That kind of makes you wonder.
It does. So, Alan, we've got to wrap it up. The 2 hours went way too quick, as it always does. For our listeners out there, pick up Alan's book, From Atom to Omega, An Anatomy of UFO Phenomena. Check out his website at FromAtomToOmega.com. Alan, as always, my friend, it's an honor to have you on, and let's get you back on before Christmas.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Looking forward to it.
I will stay in touch with you.
Okay, Pat. You take care.
Take care, AR. Have a good night. Thank you for being here tonight.
My pleasure.
Sounds good. Bye-bye.
Right.